The sound came first. Not shouting, not sirens, just the low, grinding scrape of a leather briefcase being dragged across the stone steps of the Houston federal courthouse, that particular sound of something being moved against its will, slow and deliberate and wrong, in a way that made the air feel different. Dale Pruitt had his left hand on her right arm, his partner Connor Briggs had her left shoulder, and Loretta Mae Caldwell, 54 years old, charcoal blazer, pressed the way her mother had taught her slacks with a crease sharp enough to cut paper. Natural hair, pulled back at the neck, was being walked backward down the front steps of the courthouse where she worked, where she had been appointed 6 weeks ago by a federal commission, where her name was on a docket that had been posted since Monday, where 12 people were already waiting in the gallery of courtroom 4B for a judge who had not yet arrived. She was not fighting. She never fought. That wasn't the lesson her father had taught her. Her hands were open at her sides and her face was composed in the particular way that people who have spent a lifetime navigating rooms that weren't built for them learn to compose their faces, not blank, not defeated, but locked into something quiet and unbreakable that takes years of practice to build and a single careless morning to test. The morning fog off Buffalo Bayou was still hanging low over the street, that particular Houston fog that smells like river water and warm concrete, and it wrapped around the steps of the courthouse and made the scene feel unreal, like something happening behind glass. On the sidewalk across the street, a garbage truck idled at the corner. Its engine turned over in a slow, rhythmic rumble that had nothing to do with anything and somehow made everything worse. A bike courier in a yellow jacket had stopped at the crosswalk. He looked at the steps. Then he looked at his phone. Then he looked away. A middle-aged woman carrying grocery bags had slowed her pace on the sidewalk. She took one step toward the steps. Then she stopped. An older man in a postal uniform stood near the bus shelter watching with the particular stillness of a man who has seen this before, not this exact thing. Not these exact steps, but this shape of thing. This arrangement of power and assumption and someone being moved when they should not be moved. And at the far end of the bus shelter, with a paper coffee cup in one hand and a library bag in the other, stood Patricia Odom, 61 years old. Retired schoolteacher, 35 years at Wheatley Elementary. Mother of 1. Grandmother of 2. A woman who had spent more than 3 decades teaching children that the rules existed to protect them, and who had spent roughly that same amount of time watching the rules protect some people considerably more reliably than others. She watched the 2 officers move the woman in the charcoal blazer down the steps. She watched the woman's briefcase scrape across the stone. She watched the woman say something calm, clear 4 words or maybe 5, and watched the taller officer respond with a brief dismissive gesture that said he had already decided he was done listening. Patricia Odom set down her coffee cup on the top of the bench beside her. She did not know who this woman was. She did not know her name or her title, or the 31 cases she had been assigned since her appointment, or the 29 years she had spent building toward the position that was printed right now in black ink on the docket posted outside courtroom 4B. She knew only what she could see: a woman who was not fighting, a woman who was not running, a woman who was saying something quietly and clearly that the men holding her arms had already decided didn't matter. Patricia reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. She pressed record. The video would be 1 minute and 14 seconds long. 17 minutes earlier, the 7B line from Sunnyside ran on the half hour on weekday mornings, and Loretta Mae Caldwell had been riding it to the courthouse 3 mornings a week since her appointment, because the other 2 mornings she drove, and because her father had told her 30 years ago that the fastest way to forget where you came from was to stop going back. The bus smelled like hand sanitizer and someone's coffee and the faint particular warmth of people going to work in the early morning. That smell that was exhaustion and purpose mixed together. And Loretta had sat in the 3rd seat from the front, with her leather briefcase on her lap and her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, and reviewed the morning docket on her phone, the way she reviewed every morning docket carefully, completely, the way you prepare for something that matters. 3 defendants on the 8:30 criminal docket. 2 motions already filed and waiting for ruling. A bail review that had been postponed twice and couldn't be postponed again without consequences for the man sitting in a holding cell who had a job waiting for him if the numbers worked out. She had been up since 5:15. She had made her father's recipe for oatmeal, the one with the brown sugar and the pinch of salt that she still made even though she lived alone, because some habits carry the people who taught them to you. She had called the memory care facility to check on his morning before she left. The nurse said he was having a good day. Loretta had said thank you and meant it the way you mean it when good days are not something you can count on. The 7B let her off at the corner of Rusk and Fannin at 6:29 a.m., and she walked the half block to the courthouse in the Houston morning, which was already warm enough to remind you that summer was still close that October. In Texas was not October anywhere else. She was not thinking about the fog or the warmth or the city coming awake around her. She was thinking about the bail review, about the man in the holding cell, about whether the numbers were going to work. The judge's entrance was on the north side of the building behind the parking structure, accessed by a key card that was supposed to read her badge automatically and let her through. She had used it a dozen times without incident. This morning there was yellow caution tape across the card reader and a handwritten note taped to the door in blue marker, the letters slightly uneven from being written in a hurry. Use main entrance, see security. Loretta looked at the note. Then she looked at her watch. It was 6:31. She had been through the main entrance before twice when the scanner had been down for maintenance in her first 2 weeks. It was not complicated. You presented yourself at the security checkpoint, you showed your judicial ID, and they walked you through. The whole thing took 4 minutes. She went around to the main entrance. The lobby in the early morning had a particular quality of light, fluorescent and slightly blue, not quite warm enough to feel welcoming, but not harsh, either the light of a building that ran on schedules and took itself seriously. The marble floors had been cleaned overnight and still held the sharp lemon and ammonia smell of the industrial wax they used, and a maintenance worker was pushing a cart of folded American flags down the far corridor, the cart's wheel squeaking slightly with every third rotation. Loretta walked to the security checkpoint. Dale Pruitt was behind the desk, sitting sideways in his chair, eating a breakfast sandwich wrapped in foil from the cafe 2 blocks over. The foil crinkled when he unwrapped another bite. He did not look up. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall. She had reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck because she had given up pretending she didn't need them at distances under 2 feet. Her briefcase was worn at the handle and the corners genuinely worn, not fashionably worn. Worn the way things get worn when they have been used every day for nearly 30 years and carried everything that mattered and some things that were just heavy. She looked like someone's aunt. She looked like the woman at your church who organized the food drive. She looked like a 5th grade teacher or a hospital administrator or the kind of person who had your grandmother's number memorized. She did not look like what Dale Pruitt expected to see coming through the main entrance at 6:32 on a Tuesday morning heading toward the judicial wing, and that the gap between what she was and what he was prepared to see was the whole story. Dale Pruitt had been doing this job for 18 years, and in those 18 years he had developed a precise and comprehensive mental map of this building that he genuinely believed was the same thing as knowing it. He knew the judges by sight, most of them. He knew the clerks by name, most of them. He knew which attorneys parked in the east lot and which ones always tried to use the loading dock entrance when they were running late, and he knew which paralegals carried coffee for their bosses and which ones carried it for themselves, and he knew the rhythm of the building, the way a ship's engineer knows the sound of the engine, not because he had read about it, but because he had been standing in the middle of it for a very long time. What he did not know because he had traded shifts with a colleague and missed the mandatory new personnel briefing 3 weeks ago, a decision he had made without much thought because the personnel briefings were usually about parking validations and updated badge protocols. Nothing that felt urgent was that 6 weeks ago, the Chief Judge's office had appointed a new federal judge to courtroom 4B. Her name had been in the briefing packet. Her photograph had been in the briefing packet. Her badge number and her assignment and her scheduled start date had all been in the briefing packet. Dale Pruitt had not read the briefing packet. The official portrait, the one that was supposed to hang in the gallery hallway beside the other judges, the formal photograph in the black robe with the American flag behind it, was sitting in a cardboard box in the clerk's office because the framing company had back-ordered the right size matte board and nobody had followed up aggressively enough to make it a priority. So there was no photograph on the wall. There was no face he recognized. There was only a woman in a blazer with an old briefcase who had come in through the main entrance on a Tuesday morning and was walking with the particular direction and purpose of someone who knew exactly where she was going. And Dale Pruitt's 18-year mental map of this building did not have her in it. He was 48 years old, buzz-cut, going gray at the temples, broad-shouldered in the way of a man who had been athletic in his 20s and had maintained just enough of it to feel like it still counted. He had washed out of a sheriff's deputy training program in the fall of 1998, a fact he mentioned to no one ever, and had not mentioned for so long that he had almost convinced himself it was no longer relevant, and had come to courthouse security through a temp placement that turned permanent, and then permanent turned into a career, and the career turned into an identity, and the identity had calcified around the certainty that 18 years of showing up made him someone who understood how things worked. Connor Briggs was 26 years into a 2-year-old habit of doing exactly what Dale Pruitt did. He was 31, sharp-featured, eager in the way of someone who had not yet learned that eagerness without judgment was just another word for risk. He had been assigned to Pruitt's checkpoint rotation 7 months ago, and had in those 7 months never once seen Pruitt be wrong about anything, or rather had never seen Pruitt admit to being wrong about anything, which when you are 31 and looking for a model of how to do the job can feel like the same thing. Pruitt saw Loretta approach the checkpoint. No lanyard, no badge visible at the collar or the lapel. No attorney ID clipped to the outside of the briefcase. No familiar face. No robe bag over the arm. The judges usually came in early with the black garment bags draped over the arm or the rolling cart, and he had learned to read that as a signal the same way he had learned to read the parking permits and the paralegal badges. She had none of those signals. She had a charcoal blazer and an old briefcase and a direction and a pace that said she was not confused about where she was going. In Dale Pruitt's experience, the people who came through the main entrance heading toward the judicial wing without visible credentials either had a simple explanation: they'd forgotten their badge, their lanyard had broken, the scanner was down, or they were somewhere they shouldn't be. The process for both situations was the same. You stopped them, you asked for identification, you verified, and you either walked them through or you redirected them. That was the protocol. Written clearly in the training manual. Verified, then acted on. Not acted on, then considered. What Pruitt did was not the protocol. He stood up from his chair. He stepped out from behind the desk, and before Loretta had reached the checkpoint, before she had been given the opportunity to explain herself, before he had asked a single question, he stepped directly into her path. She stopped. She looked at him. And Dale Pruitt, with 18 years of certainty and a half-eaten breakfast sandwich still in his left hand, said, "Can't come through here." "I'm Judge Caldwell," she said. "I'm assigned to courtroom 4B. 4 words and a title. Clear. Unhurried. The way you say something you have said before and expect to only have to say once." Pruitt's expression didn't shift. He set the breakfast sandwich down on the desk without looking at it. "You got a badge." "My judicial ID is in my briefcase," Loretta said. "I'll show you." She reached for the clasp. Pruitt's hand came out and touched the handle of the briefcase, not grabbing it, not yet, but resting on it, a gesture of interruption. "Step back from the entrance first." Loretta looked at his hand on her briefcase. She had been a black woman in American courtrooms for 29 years. She had been talked over, dismissed, mistaken for support staff, asked if she was sure she was in the right place, told she was articulate, told she was aggressive, when she was simply certain talked to. In the slow and careful way people talk to someone they have already decided needs correction. She had a library of these moments inside her. Not the burning kind of library, not the kind you stoke to stay angry, but the quiet reference kind, the kind you consult when you need to know what you are dealing with and what the cost of each available response will be. She consulted it now. The calculation she ran, the one she ran in approximately 3 seconds standing at the security checkpoint of her own courthouse at 6:34 in the morning, was this: she could insist clearly and firmly that she was a federal judge, and that his hand on her briefcase was inappropriate, And what would happen is that this man who had already decided something about her would hear that insistence as confirmation of whatever he had already decided. Or she could comply. Move back. Let him run his process. Let the truth arrive the way it always arrived, through the front door in its own time, undeniable. She had learned this not because it was fair. It was not fair. She had learned it because it worked, and because she had seen what happened to people, women who looked like her men, who looked like her father when they chose the other option in a room like this one. And what happened was not justice. What happened was paperwork and bruises and a news cycle that spent most of its energy asking what they had done wrong. She stepped back from the entrance. "Thank you," Pruitt said with a particular inflection that was not thankful at all. It was the inflection of a man who had just proven something to himself. He reached for his radio. He spoke into it briefly, low enough that Loretta could not hear the exact words, but the code he used, she would learn this later from the incident, documentation was for unauthorized individual attempting restricted access. Not unknown individual requesting verification. Unauthorized. Attempting restricted access. Two specific choices that were not accurate and that once spoken into the radio and logged in the system became the official description of what was happening. Connor Briggs appeared from the side corridor reading Pruitt's posture the way he had been reading it for 7 months. Tight, shoulder-squared stance, chin slightly up and taking his position without a word being exchanged between them because Pruitt's body language had its own language and Connor had become fluent in it. 40 feet away, in the elevator lobby near the clerk's office entrance, Monica Hayes had come around the corner with a folder of morning filings and had stopped when she saw the 2 security officers and the woman in the charcoal blazer. Monica Hayes was 38 years old. She had worked in this courthouse for 11 years through 4 different presiding judges, 2 courthouse renovations, 1 bomb threat that turned out to be a forgotten gym bag, and approximately 6,000 mornings. She knew every judge by sight. She had attended the new personnel briefing. She knew exactly who she was looking at. She started walking. Quickly. She was not going to make it in time. Pruitt put his hand on Loretta's arm. Not violently. Not with obvious malice. With the calm, practiced grip of a man who had decided what was happening and had decided what to do about it, and was doing it the way he had done similar things many times before, as if the decision had already been made and the physical action was simply its ordinary continuation. "You need to come outside with me, ma'am," he said. "Officer?" Loretta said, her voice still level, still carrying the particular weight of someone who is not afraid but is paying very close attention. "I am a judge. My name is Loretta Caldwell. I am assigned to this courthouse. I need to show you my identification." "We'll sort that out outside," Pruitt said. Connor Briggs moved to her other side, the briefcase. Her father's briefcase, the one with the worn handle and the brass clasp that had clicked 10,000 times, scraped across the marble floor. Monica Hayes was still 15 feet away. She said, "Wait," and the word came out and landed and did nothing. The lobby continued its morning. The maintenance worker's cart squeaked down the far corridor. The fluorescent lights hummed. Loretta May Caldwell was walked backward through the main entrance and out into the Houston fog, and Dale Pruitt's radio crackled with a response and he answered it, and none of it was what any of them would be able to call protocol when they were asked about it later, under oath with a recorder running, and a federal civil rights compliance officer taking notes. Patricia Odom had not planned to be on this corner at this particular moment. She had planned to be on the 6:55 bus to the library where she was returning 4 books she had finished and picking up one she had reserved, and then she had planned to walk 3 blocks to the rec center where she volunteered on Tuesday mornings helping seniors fill out their Medicare paperwork, which was not glamorous work but was necessary work, and she had decided long ago that necessary work was the kind worth doing. The bus had been late. That was the beginning and the end of why she was standing here. She was 61 years old, and she was wearing her good wool coat, not her very best, which she saved for church and funerals, but her good one. Charcoal gray with the brass buttons her daughter kept threatening to replace with something more modern. She had her library bag over one shoulder and her coffee from the corner bodega in her right hand, and she had been standing at the bus stop for 11 minutes, which was long enough to notice things. She had noticed the fog. She had noticed the garbage truck. She had noticed the two officers at the top of the courthouse steps because the courthouse was directly across the street and hard to miss, and because she had stood at this bus stop at least twice a week for the better part of a decade, and she knew what the morning looked like from here. She had noticed the woman in the charcoal blazer come around the corner and go up the steps, and then she had noticed what happened next. The whole thing unfolded in the time it took the garbage truck to travel half a block. Two officers, one woman, a briefcase on a strap that wasn't long enough to keep it off the ground when they pulled her backward. A brief exchange, she was too far away to hear, but close enough to read the woman speaking. The taller officer responding with a gesture that was short and final, the way you gesture at something you've already decided is settled. Patricia thought about her son Darnell, 31 years old, an accountant. He had his own office in a building in Midtown and a parking spot with his name on it and a business card that said Director of Financial Services. And twice in the past 3 years he had been stopped while walking to that office from the parking garage by people who needed to know where he worked and what he was doing there. She thought about what he had told her each time, how he had answered the questions, calmly, carefully, with his hands visible and his voice measured because that was the calculation that was always the calculation. And she hated that her son knew how to make that calculation without thinking about it, hated that she had been the one to teach him, hated that teaching him was the most loving thing she knew how to do. She pressed record. The video was not dramatic. That was the thing about it, the thing that would matter later. It was quiet. The sound of the street in the morning, the garbage truck bird somewhere, two officers and a woman. No shouting, no resistance. Just the scraping of the briefcase and the woman's feet finding the step, and then the next step, and then the concrete of the front plaza, and then the taller officer saying something, and the woman sitting down on the steps still with her briefcase in her lap like someone waiting for a bus. Like she was just waiting. The young man on the bicycle looked at the steps and looked at his phone and found something on his phone more demanding of his attention. The woman with the grocery bags took half a step toward the scene and then thought about something Patricia could not have said. What, but she could read the moment in the woman's body, that specific hesitation of a person calculating what stepping forward would cost them, and stopped. The man in the postal uniform watched with the face of stone that Patricia recognized the face of accumulated knowledge of too many mornings like this one filed away in a place where you kept things you couldn't change. Patricia kept filming. Across the street, on the steps of the Houston Federal Courthouse, Loretta Mae Caldwell sat with her father's briefcase in her lap and her hands folded on top of it, and looked out at the street with the particular expression of a woman who has made a decision she intends to keep the decision to be still, to wait, to let the truth move at its own speed, which she knew from 30 years of experience was slower than it should be, but faster in the end than the alternative. Dale. Pruitt, inside the glass doors, went back to his desk. He picked up his breakfast sandwich. He took a bite. He reached for the incident report form. Patricia lowered her phone. She looked at what she had filmed. 1 minute and 14 seconds. No filter, no narration. Just what happened and what it looked like, which was, she thought, standing at a bus stop in the Houston morning with her library bag on her shoulder and the garbage truck pulling away from the curb enough. She made a decision. She put her coffee down on the bench. She opened her contacts and found her daughter's name. She pressed call. Monica Hayes stood at the clerk's office window and looked at Loretta sitting on the steps, and the feeling that moved through her was not simple enough to call guilt. Though guilt was part of it. It was the specific compound feeling of a person who saw something happening and could not move fast enough to stop it, which is different from not trying and different from not caring, but does not feel different in the body from either of those things. She had been 11 feet too far away, 15 maybe. She had said, wait, and the word had arrived after the fact like a door closing on the echo of a sound. She had watched the briefcase cross the marble floor, and she had said, wait, and she might as well have said nothing. She went to her desk. She pulled up the appointment files not because she needed to confirm she already knew, but because she needed the act of confirming, needed to see the name and the number and the date on the official document, needed to hold the facts in her hands so they would stop moving. Honorable Loretta Mae Caldwell, appointed to the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Texas, assigned Courtroom 4, B. Effective date 6 weeks prior. Morning docket 8:30 a.m. criminal calendar. Monica's hands were not shaking from fear for herself. She had not done anything wrong. She had not been involved. No one was going to ask her to account for anything except what she witnessed, and what she had witnessed, she was ready to describe clearly and completely and without hesitation. Her hands were shaking because she understood with the full institutional comprehension of 11 years in this building exactly what had happened. Not just the physical event, the whole shape of it. A federal judge at her own courthouse told she did not belong here and removed before anyone who could have stopped it arrived. She called Gary Rush's office. His assistant said he was in a budget meeting and she would pass along the message. She called the judicial marshal's desk. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She went to the window again. Loretta was still there. Still briefcase in a lap looking at the street. The fog was beginning to lift off the bayou. The morning was getting lighter. Monica had Ray Dunbar's cell number because she had been in this courthouse long enough to collect the numbers that mattered, the ones that were not on any official list but were the actual architecture of how things got handled when the official list didn't have an answer. She dialed it. He picked up on the second ring. She told him calmly in order, without editorializing Judge Caldwell's scanner down main entrance, Pruitt the steps right now. She heard him stop moving. "Is she hurt?" he asked. "I don't think so," Monica said. "Don't call anyone else," he said. "I'm walking out there." Monica put down the phone and looked out to the window. She could see from this angle the corner of the front steps, Loretta's shoulder, the dark leather of the briefcase, the morning light coming in low and thin off the street. She stood at that window for a long moment, and what she felt was not panic and not relief, and not even anger, though all 3 were present, but something older and more patient. The feeling of a woman who had worked in American institutions long enough to know that this moment was not exceptional. That was the weight of it. Not the surprise of it, because she was not surprised, not really, not at the bottom of it, but the confirmation of something she already knew and had hoped this particular morning in this particular building on behalf of this particular woman would not be confirmed again. She had work to do. She turned from the window. She pulled out her files. She began composing the written account she would need, the contemporaneous record of what she had seen, and when drafted carefully and factually with times and locations and exact words where she had them. Because the truth told clearly was the only version that held up, and she intended to tell it clearly. Ray Dunbar had been in the courthouse parking garage for 4 minutes when his phone rang. He had parked in his usual spot, 3rd level northwest corner, near the stairwell out of habit more than necessity, and he was walking toward the elevator with his travel mug in one hand and his access badge in the other, thinking about nothing more complicated than the morning schedule. He was 52 years old and had been a U.S. Marshal for 24 years, which meant he had seen most of what this city had to offer in the way of unexpected things, and had developed the kind of equanimity about unexpected things that comes not from not caring, but from understanding that caring loudly does not help anyone, and caring steadily over time does. He listened to Monica Hayes without interrupting. When she finished, he was standing still, not frozen still. The difference being that frozen is involuntary and still is a choice, and what Ray Dunbar did in the 3 seconds after Monica finished speaking was the choice of a man processing a fact that should not be a fact and deciding what to do about it, and deciding quickly. He had been at Loretta Caldwell's swearing-in ceremony 6 weeks ago. It had been a Tuesday afternoon, and the Chief Judge's courtroom had been full in the way it got full for appointments, a specific mix of formal and personal. The robes and the suits, and the families who had come dressed for the occasion and were not quite sure where to look. He had stood near the back, as was his function. He had watched her take the oath with both hands on the Bible her father had sent, the old leather one with the gold lettering worn off the cover. He remembered Reverend Thomas Caldwell in the front row. Small man, white hairsuit pressed so carefully it looked like it had never been folded. He had sat with his hands in his lap and watched his daughter take the oath with the expression of a man receiving something he had believed in for a very long time, and was still not entirely sure was real. After the ceremony, Loretta had said a few words. She had said the courthouse was the people's building. She had said that was not a sentiment, it was a responsibility, and she intended to treat it as one. Ray Dunbar had thought standing at the back of the courtroom, "Yes, that's right, that's exactly right." He set his coffee mug on the hood of the car next to his. He was not going to need it for the next few minutes. "Don't call anyone else," he told Monica. "I'm walking out there." He walked to the elevator. He pressed the lobby level. He rode down in the particular silence of an elevator in a parking garage that enclosed utilitarian quiet, and he looked at the floor indicator, and he thought about what he was about to walk into. Not the logistics of it, not the institutional ramifications, but the human fact of it. The woman sitting on the front steps of her own courthouse because a man with a radio and 18 years of certainty had looked at her and decided she didn't belong. He had seen this shape of thing before. Different circumstances, different buildings, different people. The same shape, the same gap between what was true and what someone in a position to enforce something had decided to believe. He stepped out of the elevator. He walked through the lobby past the checkpoint where Connor Briggs was at his post and did not recognize the expression on Dunbar's face as anything that should concern him, which was its own kind of information, and out through the side corridor to the building's exterior. He came around the corner. He saw her. He crossed the plaza. He sat down next to her on the steps. Not above her, not across from her. Next to her at the same level on the same step. He said her name. He had counted them once early in his assignment, the way you catalog a building when you're learning it, 31 steps from the main entrance to the street level. Wide granite treads with low risers, the kind of monumental staircase that was designed to make people feel the weight of the institution they were approaching. Loretta was sitting on the 4th step from the bottom. Her briefcase was in her lap, both hands resting on top of it. Her reading glasses were slightly askew, pushed a centimeter to the left of where they usually sat, and he would not have noticed this if he had not been paying very close attention. But he was paying very close attention, and that small displacement was the only visible evidence of the physical contact. Everything else about her was composed with a precision that he recognized as costing something. The fog was lighter now. The garbage truck had gone. The postal worker was still at the bus stop, watching with the same stone face, and he gave Ray Dunbar a single nod when their eyes met the nod of one man to another, across a scene that both of them understood in the way you understand things you were not supposed to have to understand. Ray sat down next to Loretta. He did not say anything immediately because there was nothing to say immediately that would have been right. He let the morning sit between them for a moment to the sound of the city, a bus somewhere on Rusk, a mockingbird doing its morning catalog in the live oak at the corner of the lot. Then he said her name. Just her name. Quietly, like a question that already knew its answer. She told him what had happened. She told it the way she told everything, in order with precision, without dramatizing any of it, and without minimizing any of it either, because minimizing the truth to make it easier for people to hear was a habit she had never been willing to develop. He listened. He did not say, "I cannot believe it." He did not perform shock because performing shock at the expense of a person who has just been through something is one of the most common and least examined ways of making that person feel worse. It makes the story about the listener's surprise rather than the speaker's experience. He listened, and when she finished, he said, "I'm sorry this happened here." She looked at the street. A pigeon was doing something complicated with a pretzel wrapper near the base of the live oak. "I have a 8:30 docket," she said. "I know," he said. He stood up. He buttoned his jacket not hurriedly, but with the specific deliberateness of a man preparing to be official about something. He looked back at the courthouse entrance. Through the glass doors, Dale Pruitt was visible at the checkpoint desk, his back partially turned, writing something. Writing the incident report as it would turn out. Writing in his own words his version of what had happened and why it was appropriate. Ray Dunbar had spent 24 years understanding that the version someone writes in the first hour is not always the version that survives contact with the full truth. He pulled out his radio. He contacted the supervisory marshal's office. He spoke clearly and without urgency, because urgency on a radio changes the shape of what people hear before they have all the facts. He stated what he had observed. He stated what he had been told. He stated the identity of the person sitting on the front steps of the Houston Federal Courthouse. There was a pause on the other end of the radio. Then a voice said, "Say again." He said it again. Another pause. "We're sending someone to you right now," the voice said. "Do not move from that position." He looked at Loretta. She was still watching the street, the city going about its morning ordinary and indifferent, a bus pulling up to the stop across the way, and the doors opening, and a handful of people stepping off into the Tuesday. "They're coming," he said. She nodded, the way you nod when you already knew they were coming, had always known they would come eventually, and have simply been waiting for eventually to arrive. This is the part of the story you need to understand the rest of it. Because if you only see a woman sitting on courthouse steps, patient and still and seemingly unmoved, you will wonder why. You will wonder how. You will look at the composure and call it strength, which it is, but strength is not the same thing as simplicity, and what was happening inside Loretta May Caldwell on those steps was not simple at all. Reverend Thomas Caldwell was 79 years old and lived now in a memory care facility in the 3rd Ward, 10 minutes from the house where Loretta had grown up. He had good days and difficult ones. On his good days, he remembered her name before she said it, and asked about her cases, and told her the same 3 stories from his childhood that she had heard so many times they had become part of her own memory. The summer he picked cotton at 13 to buy his mother a hat the first time he preached a sermon and forgot the text, and just talked about what he knew the evening his father showed him a deed to a small piece of land in Grimes County and said, "This is ours, and no one can take what is written down." On his difficult days he looked at her with a gentleness that was clearly love, but could not locate her name, and she sat with him and held his hand and talked about small things, the mockingbirds, the weather. Whether the food was good, and she did not make him work for what he could not find. She had called that morning before she left the house. The nurse said he was having a good day. She was thinking about this on the steps. Not about Pruitt, not about the incident report being written inside, not about the radio call or the consequences or the institutional machinery that was already without her doing anything beginning to turn. She was thinking about her father. She was 24 the first time she failed the bar exam. She had studied for 7 months, had given it everything she had, and the letter came back with the wrong result, and she drove to her father's house in Sunnyside and sat on his porch steps. These steps were smaller, wooden, the paint peeling at the edges the way it always had, and she did not speak for a long time. Her father brought her a glass of sweet tea, and sat next to her and did not say anything either for a while. He had learned in nearly 3 decades of pastoring that the silence after a hard thing was not a problem to be solved. When he finally spoke, he said, "Did you understand what you missed?" She said yes. He said, "Then you know what to do with the next 7 months." She passed the second time. The day she got the letter, she went back to his porch, and this time she did not sit on the steps. She stood in the yard in the afternoon light, and he came out and saw her face and understood and went back inside and came back out carrying an old leather briefcase. It had been his own father's, used for decades to carry the church's collection ledgers and financial records, the accounting of a small congregation's faith expressed in numbers. He held it out to her. It was worn at the corners and the handle. It smelled like old leather and something else, something. She could never quite name, old paper, old wood. The specific smell of something that had been used for important things by careful people for a long time. "The law is in here, baby girl," he said. "Carry it like it's yours, because it is." She had carried it every day since. 29 years. Every courtroom she had argued in before she was a judge, and every courtroom she had presided over since. It was in her lap right now, on the steps of the Houston Federal Courthouse, the handle still worn in the exact shape of her grip. She was not thinking about Dale Pruitt. She was thinking about her father's face when he handed her the briefcase, the particular expression on it which was not pride. Exactly, though, pride was in it, and was not hope exactly, though. Hope was in it, but was something that combined both of those things with a third thing that she had spent 29 years trying to find a name for. She thought it might be recognition. The look of a man who has believed in something for a very long time finally seeing it standing in front of him. In the distance, Ray Dunbar's radio crackled with a response. She heard the voice on the other end say something she couldn't quite make out. She heard Ray say something back, low and clear. She felt the morning beginning to change. She had always known it would change. That was never the question. The question was only how long she had to sit on these steps first and whether she could hold on to what her father had given her. Not the briefcase, but what it meant while she waited. She could. She had learned that from him, too. Information moves through a courthouse the way water moves through old pipes. Not always in the direction you'd expect, not always at the speed you need, but eventually reaching every corner of the building with a thoroughness that would be impressive if the circumstances were different. Monica Hayes had told the clerk's office supervisor at 6:52 a.m. The supervisor, a methodical woman named Arlene, had taken 30 seconds to process what she was hearing and then had gone very still. In the particular way that experienced bureaucrats go still when they understand they are standing inside a situation that will be documented extensively and consulted repeatedly for years to come. She had gone directly to Gary Rush's office and was standing outside his door with her arms folded when his 700 budget meeting ended. Two attorneys, a defense lawyer named Howard Fitch and a prosecutor named Elena Marsh, who were both scheduled for the 8:30 docket, arrived at the main entrance at 7:08 and 7:11 respectively. And both of them slowed their pace when they noticed the U.S. Marshal standing on the front steps next to a woman in a blazer who was sitting very still and not talking to anyone. Attorneys who appear before federal judges develop over time a sensitivity to unusual configurations of official-looking people, and both of them filed the image away with the instinct of people who have learned that the unusual configurations of Tuesday morning sometimes become the context of Tuesday afternoon. Inside, Connor Briggs was at his post near the metal detectors. He had returned there after the main entrance incident with the certainty of a man who had done his job and expected no complications to arise from it. But at 7:15, he noticed Ray Dunbar through the glass standing on the steps speaking into his radio, with the kind of deliberate quiet that was in Connor's experience more serious than shouting, and felt a small, unspecific unease settle somewhere in his chest. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself this 3 times, which was 2 times more than he would have needed to if it had actually been nothing. Dale Pruitt was at his desk, incident report form in front of him, writing with the confident hand of a man who had filled out similar forms on dozens of prior occasions and had never experienced a subsequent complication. He wrote the time of the incident, 6:34. He wrote his own name and badge number. He wrote the description of the situation: unknown individual, no visible credentials, attempting to access restricted judicial wing via main entrance checkpoint. Individual directed to exit per standard unauthorized access protocol. Individual complied and was escorted to exterior. He read it back to himself. It sounded right. It sounded like 18 years of experience producing a sensible, proportionate response to a routine situation. He dated the form and set it in the outbox. Patricia Odom's daughter Denise was at her desk at the nonprofit organization where she worked when her mother's call came in. She watched the video once while her mother was still on the phone. Then she watched it again after she hung up. She was not someone who moved quickly with things like this. She had seen enough situations handled badly by people who moved quickly to understand that the first question was not, "Who do I send this to?" but "What does it need and when?" She called the courthouse public information office. The young man who answered confirmed after a brief pause and what sounded like a search through some kind of document that, yes, the Honorable Loretta May Caldwell was the recently appointed judge assigned to courtroom 4B and was currently scheduled to preside over the 8:30 a.m. docket. Denise said thank you. She hung up. She sat with this information for approximately 90 seconds. Then she began making a list. Gary Rush came out of the budget meeting at 7:03 and saw Arlene standing outside his door and understood before she said a word that the morning had changed. He let her talk. When she finished, he did the same thing Monica Hayes had done at the window. He looked at the expression on Arlene's face and then he said in a voice that was not quite steady, "Tell me the judge went inside." Arlene's silence was the answer. Rush was already reaching for his jacket. Gary Rush was not a villain. This is important to say not because it excuses anything, but because the stories that only work when someone is a villain are not the stories that change anything. Villains are easy. Villains explain themselves. What Gary Rush was something more ordinary and more difficult, a man who had permitted a system to become what it became, and who was now being asked to look at what he had permitted. He was 55 years old. He had come up through courthouse security the same way Pruitt had, from the bottom, assignment by assignment, commendation by commendation. A career built on showing up reliably and managing problems before they became crises. He had been promoted to security director 8 years ago because he was good at the operational side of things, staffing protocols, the logistics of moving people through a federal building safely and efficiently, and because he had relationships with the officers. Under his supervision, relationships built over years, the kind that made the daily work easier. Dale Pruitt was one of those relationships. They had come up together. Rush had given Pruitt his first commendation. He had also, 3 times in 18 years, received complaints about Pruitt that he had reviewed and resolved informally, a word that in the language of institutional management meant handled without documentation, without the formal record that would have followed Pruitt forward and accumulated into something unavoidable. He had done this because each individual complaint had seemed viewed on its own like something that could be addressed with a conversation. He had not looked at all 3 together. He had not added them up. He was about to. He walked to the main entrance. Not running. Running would announce visibly that something had gone wrong, and until he had the full picture, he needed to be a man walking to his checkpoint, not a man running toward a crisis. He pushed through the glass doors. Pruitt looked up from his desk. "Morning, Gary." Rush stopped in front of the checkpoint. He looked at Pruitt's outbox where the incident report was sitting crisp and dated, the ink still fresh. "Tell me what happened this morning," he said. His voice was level, not cold, not warm level the way a structure is level when it is bearing weight. Pruitt told him. The account was practiced even before it was a practiced account. It was the version Pruitt had been constructing since 635, the version in which everything made sense, in which protocol had been followed, in which a man with 18 years of experience had done exactly what his training required of him in the face of an uncertain situation. Rush listened to the whole thing. Then he said, "Did she identify herself?" "She said she was a judge," Pruitt said. "But Gary, she had no visible—" "Did you attend the new personnel briefing?" Rush said. Not a question, or rather a question that already knew its answer. The pause that followed was not long, but it was full. "I traded that shift," Pruitt said. Rush closed his eyes. Not dramatically, briefly, the way you close your eyes when you are calculating something you would rather not calculate. The briefing had included a photograph, a badge number, a courtroom assignment. All the information Pruitt would have needed to recognize Loretta Caldwell at 6:34 a.m. on a Tuesday morning with a malfunctioning scanner and a worn leather briefcase. Pruitt had not been there. Rush opened his eyes. "Where is she now?" "I escorted her outside," Pruitt said. "Unauthorized." "She is the presiding judge of courtroom 4B, Rush said, and the sentence landed the way sentences land when they reorganize everything in the room. "She has an 8:30 docket. There are defendants waiting." Pruitt's face did something complicated. The certainty on it did not disappear. It couldn't disappear that quickly, not after 18 years of construction. But it shifted the way load-bearing structures shift when something fundamental changes, and you could see the beginning of the understanding working its way through him, slow and reluctant and unavoidable. Rush picked up the incident report from the outbox. He held it for a moment. Then he put it in his jacket pocket. He walked back outside. Rush came around the building and saw Ray Dunbar on the steps and Loretta beside him, and he walked toward them with the deliberate pace of a man who has accepted that there is no version of this next 30 seconds that goes well, and who has decided that the only available response to that fact is to be honest. Dunbar stepped to the side when Rush approached. He didn't go far. He stayed within range because he was Ray Dunbar, and that was his function, and he was not going to stop functioning. Rush stopped in front of Loretta. He stood for a moment without speaking, and in that moment he was not the security director of the Houston Federal Courthouse. He was a 55-year-old man who had made decisions over 18 years that had arrived this Tuesday morning at this exact point on these steps, and he needed to stand in that for a second before he said anything. "Judge Caldwell," he said. "My name is Gary Rush. I'm the security director. What happened this morning should not have happened, and I am sorry that it happened in this building on these steps to you." Loretta looked at him, not through him, at him directly, with the attention of someone who is listening to what is being said, and also to what is not being said, and measuring both. He continued. He told her that Officer Pruitt had missed the new personnel briefing. He told her the scanner malfunction had not been communicated to overnight staff in the way it should have been. He told her that neither of these things was an explanation, and he was not presenting them as one. He was simply giving her the facts, because she deserved the facts, all of them in order. She let him finish. Then she said, "I need to get to my courtroom." Not, "I accept your apology." Not, "Thank you for coming." Those were the responses of a person in a social situation, and this was not a social situation. This was a woman whose 8:30 docket had defendants waiting in it, and she was 17 minutes behind where she needed to be, and that was the priority. Rush said, "Yes, ma'am." She stood up. She picked up her briefcase. She smoothed the front of her blazer with one hand, a small, particular gesture. The gesture of a person putting the outside of themselves back in order. Not because the inside needed it, but because the outside was what the room would see. She was standing on the 4th step from the bottom, which meant she was standing above the level of the plaza, above the level where Rush stood, and there was nothing theatrical about it. It was simply the geometry of where she had been sitting, but the image of it, the physical fact of it, was something that everyone present would remember. She walked up the steps, past Rush, who held the door, through the main entrance. The lobby, with the fluorescent lights, the marble floors, with the dried lemon wax smell, the American flags. Past the security checkpoint. Dale Pruitt was standing at his desk. He had been standing there since Rush went outside, not at his station doing his job, but standing behind his desk, slightly back from it, as if he had moved away from something without meaning to. The incident report was no longer in the outbox. He had not noticed that Rush had taken it. Loretta walked past the checkpoint. She did not look at Pruitt. She did not look at him, and the not looking was more complete and more final than any look could have been. It was the not looking of a person who has assessed a situation and decided that it does not require her attention, that it will be handled by the appropriate processes through the appropriate channels, and that her attention is needed elsewhere. Pruitt looked at her. He watched her walk toward the judicial wing corridor and turn the corner and disappear. He stood behind his desk for a moment. Then he sat down. Connor Briggs at the metal detectors watched all of this without speaking, and felt the nameless unease in his chest become something with a name. The judicial anteroom behind courtroom 4B was small and spare. A coat rack, a desk, a narrow window that looked out on the rear parking lot, a full-length mirror mounted on the back of the closet door. A courthouse that had been built to be permanent and serious had given its judges this one small, practical room to put themselves together before walking into the room where everything mattered. Dana Reeves. Loretta's clerk 26 efficient, the kind of young woman who had learned early that competence was the best armor, handed her the robe the moment she came through the door. She did not say anything about the time. She did not ask what had happened. She had already heard from Monica Hayes the essential shape of the morning, and she had decided that the most useful thing she could do was have everything ready and be quiet about it. Loretta set her briefcase on the desk. She took the robe from Dana and put it on the black fabric, settling over the blazer and slacks, the zipper going up the front, the collar sitting the way it had been fitted to sit. Something shifted in the quality of the room when the robe went on. Not the person was the same person who had been on the steps 20 minutes ago, but the weight of the institution. The long history of what a federal judge's robe represented and required settled around her shoulders and became visible. Dana said quietly, "3 defendants on the docket. The Halverson bail review is 3rd, but Mr. Halverson's family has been here since 7:45. 2 motions already submitted, both simple. Mr. Fitch and Ms. Marsh are in the hallway." Loretta nodded. She straightened the robe's collar in the mirror. Her reading glasses, back in their proper position on the beaded chain, reflected the light. She went to the narrow window. The rear parking lot was ordinary and flat and unhelpful, and she looked at it anyway for 30 seconds. exactly the way she had always looked at something neutral before walking into a courtroom. It was not meditation. It was not prayer. It was simply the act of looking at something that required nothing of her while she organized what the next hours would require. Then she walked through the door into courtroom 4B. The bailiff was there. "All rise," he said, and the words rolled through the room with their old authority and 12 people in the gallery, 3 defendants' families, 4 courthouse observers, the 2 attorneys who had both slowed their pace at the entrance an hour ago and who had spent the intervening time making careful independent calculations stood. Loretta took the bench. She set the briefcase on the floor beside the bench below the sight line of the gallery. She had been setting it there in every courtroom since she was 24 years old. And she opened the docket and she looked at the first case and she looked at the clock and she said, "Be seated." The room sat. In the third row of the gallery, a woman named Vera Halverson was holding a paper program from her church, folded and refolded until the edges had gone soft. Her son Marcus, not the defendant. Marcus, but her other son, 14, who had come with her because she was not comfortable leaving him alone, was sitting next to her. And when the judge took the bench, he had leaned forward slightly the way children lean forward when something holds their attention. And he watched Loretta settle into her chair and open her files with the ease of someone settling into their own space, and he turned to his mother and whispered something, and she patted his hand without taking her eyes off the bench. Loretta did not see this. She was reading the first motion, but Dana saw it from her position near the side wall, and she remembered it. The morning docket began 17 minutes behind schedule and ran with the unhurried methodical precision of a judge who was paying full attention to each case and would not be rushed through any of them. The Halverson bail review, third on the docket, took 22 minutes. The math worked. Marcus Halverson Sr. was released with conditions. His family in the third row held each other quietly. Loretta noted the outcome, signed the order, and moved to the next matter. Outside in the corridor, the building continued about its day. Indifferent. Ordinary. Inside. Courtroom 4B, the clock on the wall, moved forward. For the first 40 minutes after Loretta walked past his checkpoint, Dale Pruitt worked. He screened bags. He waved through attorneys he recognized. He directed a visitor to the clerk's office on the second floor. He checked 2 delivery manifests and signed 1. He did all the things that his job required him to do in the ordinary run of a Tuesday morning, and he did them with the mechanical reliability of 18 years of practice because the body learns a job and continues doing it even when the mind is somewhere else. His mind was somewhere else. He was constructing. That was the only word for it. He was building in real time with the materials available to him a version of the morning that he could inhabit without too much difficulty. No visible credentials. Unfamiliar face. Main entrance approach without prior notification. Standard protocol applied to a non-standard situation. The scanner was broken. That was a building maintenance failure, not his. She had not provided documentation before he initiated the escort. He had used no excessive force. She was outside for 15 minutes, 20. The docket had started late, but not catastrophically late. He put the incident report back in the outbox. He had retrieved it from the floor beside his desk. Rush had apparently dropped it or left it, and he put it back where it belonged because it was the documented record of a standard interaction, and it needed to be on file. At 9:15, Connor Briggs came to his station on a rotation change. Connor did not ask him directly about what had happened. He asked, the way young men ask older men, things they are not sure they should be asking sideways as if approaching the question from an angle made it smaller. "Everything okay this morning?" "Fine," Pruitt said. "I saw Rush outside," Connor said. "Budget stuff," Pruitt said, which was not true and which he knew was not true and which Connor, to his credit, probably did not entirely believe, but which Connor accepted because accepting it was easier than not accepting it, which was also something Pruitt recognized. He should have felt worse about this. He told himself he would address it with Connor later when things settled. At 10:30, the elevator opened at the far end of the lobby and Gary Rush came out. He was not alone. There was a woman from the HR department whose name Pruitt knew, Patricia Cross, who wore the specific expression of HR professionals required to be present at situations that were formally happening and informally disastrous. And there was a man in a dark suit whom Pruitt did not recognize, who carried a leather folder and had the measured, neutral expression of someone whose job it was to observe. Rush walked directly to the checkpoint. He stood in front of Pruitt's desk. He said, "Dale, you're being relieved of your post effective right now pending the administrative review. Patricia is going to take your badge and your radio. You should call your union rep." Pruitt did not move immediately. He sat behind his desk and processed the sentence with the same effort he had been using all morning to process the rest of the morning, looking for the version in which it meant something other than what it meant. There was no such version. "The incident report," he started. "Is part of the documentation," Rush said. "Yes." Pruitt looked at the outbox. The incident report was gone again. He had not seen Rush take it. He stood up. He unclipped his badge. He handed over his radio. He did all of this with the careful, dignified movements of a man who was determined to demonstrate to anyone watching that he was handling this correctly, that he was the kind of man who handled things correctly. Connor Briggs was at his station near the metal detectors 20 feet away. He watched. He was close enough to see the badge change hands and to understand what that meant. He did not say anything. He was not sure what he would have said. Pruitt was walked to the administrative wing by Patricia Cross and the man in the dark suit. They passed through the lobby, past the checkpoint Pruitt had worked for 9 of his 18 years, past the metal detectors, past the side corridor where the judge's chambers were, and into the elevator. The elevator doors closed. The lobby continued. The fluorescent lights hummed. The morning docket from courtroom 4B was audible very faintly through the ventilation system. Not words, just the rhythm of a courtroom in session, measured and proceeding and ongoing. Connor Briggs stood at his station and thought about the morning, going back through it in the careful, uncomfortable way you go back through something when you are beginning to understand that you had a choice you didn't know you were making, and that you made it, and that the making of it is now part of the record of who you are. He had not questioned Pruitt. He had not asked for identification. He had not verified. He had seen his senior officer approach a woman and redirect her, and had moved to his position because that was what Pruitt's body language had required of him, and he had not thought past that. He had been doing his job the way he had been taught to do it. By whom and in what direction was the question that was going to follow him for a while. Denise Odom was 34 years old and had a particular relationship with the speed of information. She worked in communications for a housing rights nonprofit, which meant she spent most of her professional life in the gap between what was true and what was being heard. And she had developed a methodical approach to that gap that was not always comfortable to the people around her, but was generally correct. Her mother's video was 1 minute and 14 seconds. She watched it twice. The first time she watched it the way anyone watches something like this, with the immediate visceral understanding that what she was seeing was wrong, that the gap between what was happening to that woman and what should be happening to her was the gap between who we say we are and who we sometimes are, and that gap was wide and old and exhausting. The second time she watched it as a professional. Steady, camera, minimal movement. Her mother had always been good at standing still. Clear view of both officers, clear view of the woman's compliance, clear view of the briefcase on the ground, clear view of the moment she was deposited on the steps and told something that caused her to sit rather than re-enter. Her mother called back after she watched. She asked if Denise knew who the woman was. Denise told her she was going to find out. What Denise did not do was post the video. She did not send it to any media contact. She did not share it. She sat with it for a moment, understanding that information handled carelessly becomes noise, and noise benefits no one consistently. Least of all the person it is supposed to help. She called the courthouse public information office. The young man who answered was not expecting the question she asked. He fumbled briefly through something, a directory or a roster, before confirming that yes, the Honorable Loretta May Caldwell had been appointed 6 weeks ago, and was currently assigned to courtroom 4B, where the morning docket was in session. Denise said thank you. She sat with this for 90 seconds. Then she called her mother back. Patricia Odom at this point was still at the bus stop. She had missed 3 buses, each one arriving and departing, while she stood there holding her phone, and she was now going to be late for her library return and her Medicare help session. And she found that she could not locate any part of herself that was troubled by this. "Mama," Denise said, "that woman is a federal judge. She was assigned to this courthouse. She had a courtroom docket this morning." A long pause. "Well," Patricia said, and then she didn't say anything else because what was there to say that the morning hadn't already said? Denise began her list. Not of media contacts, not yet, but of institutional contacts. The courthouse's official civil rights compliance desk, the federal district's oversight office, the NAACP's Houston Legal Advocacy Coordinator, with whom Denise had a professional relationship and who she knew would ask the right questions in the right order. She worked through the list carefully, making each call with the same measured clarity she brought to everything, stating facts, not editorializing, providing the video as documentation through official channels, not through social media. She did this because she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had taught her that the fastest way to turn a truth into a controversy was to put it somewhere where other people could fight about it before the institutions responsible for addressing it had been given the chance. The institutions deserved the chance. And if they didn't take it, that was its own information, and it would keep. The video still on Patricia's phone would stay there for 11 more days before it was formally submitted as evidence. In those 11 days, it would be seen by exactly 6 people: Patricia Denise, the Civil Rights Compliance Officer, Monica Hayes, Ray Dunbar, and Chief Judge Harold Whitmore. Every one of them watched it at least twice. Gary Rush went back to his office after walking Pruitt to the administrative wing and closed the door not in the pointed dramatic way of someone who needed privacy, but in the practical way of someone who needed to think without anyone coming in to ask him something manageable. He pulled Dale Pruitt's personnel file. He had reviewed it before. Of course, 8 years ago, when he was appointed security director, he had reviewed all the files, familiarized himself with the personnel under his supervision, identified the strong performers and the ones who needed managing. He remembered Pruitt's file as clean. Commendations, solid attendance, no sustained complaints. He had been remembering the wrong thing. The commendations were there. The attendance was there. And the complaints were there too, 3 of them filed at different times over a span of 7 years. Each one individually thin enough to have been resolved informally. Each one resolved by the security director of the time. Each resolution documented not in Pruitt's formal personnel file, but in a supplementary incident log that required deliberate searching to find. Rush found it. The first complaint was from 2016. A visiting attorney there for a single-day federal hearing, a black man in his 50s who had come in without his lanyard. It had broken in the parking garage and been subjected to what he described as aggressive and demeaning screening. That was, he noted in his complaint, noticeably more extensive than the screening applied to white attorneys he had watched enter the building on the same morning. The complaint was reviewed. Pruitt was spoken to. The documentation said, addressed informally, no further action required. The second was from 2019. A postal inspector black who had been cited for trespassing while conducting a scheduled inspection of the courthouse mail processing area, an area he was authorized to access with documented authorization. Authorization that Pruitt had not requested before detaining him. The trespassing citation was withdrawn when the inspector's supervisor called. The incident was documented as miscommunication resolved. The third was from 2021. A black woman who worked in courthouse facilities maintenance, a supervisor 14 years with the building, who had been physically redirected away from a restricted corridor she had access to in front of colleagues without being asked for identification. She had filed a complaint and then withdrawn it 2 weeks later. The documentation on the withdrawal said complainant requested closure, no further action taken. It did not record what conversation had preceded her request for closure. 3 complaints. 7 years. 1 pattern. Rush sat with this document for a long time. He had approved the informal resolution of the 3rd complaint himself in his 2nd year as director. He had read the complaint had spoken to Pruitt, had written in the summary that the situation had been addressed and did not warrant formal discipline. He had believed this when he wrote it. He was no longer certain what had led him to that belief. What he understood now, looking at all three documents together, the view that was only available when you stopped looking at each one alone, was that he had been resolving individual incidents and missing the line they made when you drew them in sequence. The formal complaint to the Chief Judge's office left his desk at 11:15 a.m. It included all three prior incidents, the morning's incident, and a recommendation for administrative review and disciplinary proceedings against Officer Pruitt. It also included a separate document, a recommendation that Officer Connor Briggs receive a formal written warning and mandatory retraining. The reasoning was precise and took only one paragraph. Briggs had participated without independent verification, had followed Pruitt's lead without question, and that willingness to act without thinking was something that needed to be formally addressed before it became its own pattern. Rush wrote a third document last. It was addressed to the Chief Judge and concerned himself. It was not a confession. It was an account factual and unsparing of the three prior complaints and the decisions he had made about each one, and an acknowledgement that those decisions, individually defensible and collectively insufficient, had contributed to the circumstances that produced the morning of October 14th. He signed it. He included it with the other documents. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at his office, which was a room he had worked in for 8 years, and which looked this afternoon exactly the same as it always had, and the same desk, the same framed commendation from the Federal Judiciary Association, the same photograph of his daughter's college graduation on the shelf, and felt the particular discomfort of a person discovering that the landscape of what they believed about themselves is not as certain as the furniture suggested. Harold Whitmore had been a federal judge for 19 years and had in that time presided over cases involving every variety of human failure that a major American city could produce. Fraud, violence, the elaborate patient corruption of people in positions that required them to be something better. He was not a warm man. Warmth was not the quality his position required most frequently. What it required was precision and patience and the ability to hold the full weight of a complicated thing without letting it topple in any direction before it was ready to be resolved. He received Gary Rush's folder at 11:40 a.m. during his lunch recess. His judicial assistant brought it in without comment. She had read the cover sheet, which was sufficient to tell her that commenting on it was not her function. Whitmore read the folder once start to finish without pausing. Then he read it again more slowly, stopping at the second complaint, the 2019 postal inspector, and reading the documentation twice, and then the third complaint and Rush's self-authored account of his own decisions. He removed his reading glasses. He set them on the desk. He sat still for approximately 30 seconds. Then he picked up his reading glasses again and looked at the photograph of Patricia Odom's video, which had been printed from a digital file and included in the folder a still image from the 38-second mark showing Loretta on the steps with both officers behind her, her briefcase on the ground. Her face, in three-quarter profile, composed in the particular way that Whitmore recognized, because he had sat across from Loretta Caldwell in enough professional settings to know her face, and what was on it in this photograph was not an expression he had seen on her face before. He called his judicial assistant. He told her to cancel his afternoon. Then he made 3 calls. The first was to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Texas, a brief call, factual, informing the relevant party that a formal federal civil rights review was being initiated and that they should expect documentation within 48 hours. The second was to the headquarters of the courthouse security contractor in Virginia. This call was longer, and the voice on the other end was careful and cooperative in the way voices become careful and cooperative when the situation has already moved past the point where defensiveness serves any purpose. The third call was to Loretta's chambers. Dana answered. Loretta was on the bench, she said. Whitmore said he would wait. Loretta called back at 2:17 between the morning and afternoon sessions. She was in the anteroom. He could hear the particular quiet of that small space, the ventilation, the distant sound of the courthouse. He told her that a formal federal review was being initiated, that it would be thorough, that his office would be managing the administrative process so that her chambers were not required to do so, and that the security contractor had been notified. She listened. Then she said two things. The first was that she wanted the review to be thorough, which he had just told her it would be, but which she was stating not as a request, but as an expectation with the full weight of a federal judge stating expectations. The second was that no one on her staff should be placed in the position of managing the fallout or fielding questions or being made to serve as the institutional representative of what had happened to her. That was not their job, and she would not have them put in that position. "Understood," Whitmore said. A brief pause. "I'm sorry this happened in my courthouse, Loretta," he said. The word "my," which he had used automatically habitually the way people use possessives about things they oversee, sat in the sentence for a moment. "It's the people's building," she said. Quietly, without accusation. Just the fact of it. He didn't answer immediately because he was thinking about her swearing-in ceremony which he had presided over, and what she had said in her remarks, and how he had nodded when she said it, and what that nod had cost him in terms of actually doing what it promised. "You have a 300 docket," he said. "I do," she said. "Go back," he said. She did. Whitmore sat in his office with the folder open in front of him and the afternoon light coming in through the tall windows at the angle that meant it was after 2. And he thought about a building full of people doing their jobs. Most of them doing them as well as they knew how. And the way that doing your job well does not protect you from the thing that happens when someone nearby is doing their job according to something that is not written in any training manual. He had a great deal of work to do. He began. The house on Alameda Road in Pasadena was a ranch style with a covered porch and a 2-car driveway, and an American flag on a bracket beside the front door that Dale Pruitt replaced every 18 months regular as clockwork because the Houston Sun ate flags the way it ate everything steadily without apology. His truck was in the driveway by 1 p.m. Rex the old dog met him at the door in the way that old dogs meet people, not with the leaping enthusiasm of youth, but with a kind of dignified solidarity, a slow tail, a warm presence at the knee. He was 11 years old, and arthritic in his back legs, and had been Pruitt's dog for his entire life, and he had the particular knowledge of long familiar people that meant he could read the quality of a footstep on the porch before the door opened. Sandra was home early from the dental practice where she worked. Tuesday was her half day. She was in the kitchen making lunch, and she heard the truck, and she heard the door, and she heard the footstep, which was not the footstep of a man who had had a normal morning. She came to the kitchen doorway and looked at him. He sat down at the kitchen table. He put his hands flat on the tabletop the way people put their hands flat on things when they need to feel something solid. She sat down across from him and waited because Sandra Pruitt, 47 years old, married for 22 years, knew the difference between a man who needed to be asked and a man who needed to sit for a minute first. He told her. He told it the way he had been telling it to himself all morning, the way it made sense, the way it had the right shape, the way the pieces fit together in a version where he had done the job he was trained to do in the circumstances he was given. No visible credentials. Main entrance, not the judicial entrance. Unfamiliar face. Standard protocol, applied consistently. Sandra listened. Her face was still the particular stillness of someone who is processing carefully, who does not want to react before she has heard everything. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did she tell you she was a judge?" The question was direct and undecorated, which was Sandra's way, and it landed with the directness of something that had been in the room the whole time, waiting. Pruitt's hands were still flat on the table. "She said she was a judge," he said. "But Sandra, you can't just people say things you can't just take every... Did she tell you she was a judge?" Sandra said again, not louder, not harder, just again, clean and patient. A long pause. Rex clicked across the kitchen floor and put his head on Pruitt's knee. "Yes," Pruitt said. "She told me she was a judge." Sandra looked at him for a moment. Just looked at him with the full attention of a woman who has spent 22 years learning a person and is encountering this Tuesday afternoon a fact about that person that recontextualizes things she thought she understood. She got up from the table. She went to the sink and began doing the dishes, the lunch plates from earlier, a glass as a pot. The water ran. The dish soap smelled like green apples, the same kind they had bought for 15 years because neither of them had thought to switch. The sound of the water and the clink of dishes filled the kitchen in a way that was ordinary and domestic and completely different somehow from how it had sounded that morning. Pruitt sat at the table with Rex's head on his knee and his hands flat on the table in the afternoon light coming through the kitchen window, and the story he had been telling himself all morning. The story in which everything made sense, in which he had done his job, in which protocol was protocol, and credentials were credentials, and 18 years of experience was 18 years of experience began quietly and irreversibly to come apart. He picked up his phone. He called his union representative. It rang 5 times and went to voicemail. He left a message that was brief and careful and asked for a call back as soon as possible. He turned on the TV in the living room, which was visible from the kitchen table, and watched the 4 o'clock local news. The story was not there, not a top story, not a mention, but at the bottom of the screen in the slow scroll of the news ticker, a line moved past that said Federal Review initiated at Houston Federal Courthouse, following security incident involving judicial personnel. He read it twice, 3 times, waiting for it to scroll around again. Sandra came and stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, drying her hands on a dish towel, and she looked at the ticker, and she looked at Dale, and she didn't say anything. He turned off the television. Rex came from the kitchen and lay down on the rug near the couch, sighing the way old dogs sigh deeply contentedly with no knowledge of anything complicated. Pruitt sat in his living room in the particular silence of a house that is not angry at you and is not comforting you and is simply present, continuing to be what it has always been, which is its own kind of verdict. He thought about writing the incident report. He had written it carefully, and he had believed every word of it when he wrote it. He was not sure now that believing every word of it was the same thing as it being true. He was not sure when those 2 things had separated, or if they had ever been the same. He was not sure about a number of things he had been sure about this morning. Rex sighed again on the rug. Sandra went back to the kitchen. The afternoon continued. 6 weeks after the morning on the steps, they gathered in conference room 3C of the Houston Federal Courthouse, which was a room designed for the working meetings of lawyers and administrators. Long table, no jury box, no bench. No elevated positions of any kind, and which was by design not a courtroom, because what was happening here was not a criminal trial and did not carry the weight of one, but was something in some ways more precise. A formal administrative hearing into whether a federal employee had violated the civil rights of a federal judge on federal property. Chief Judge Harold Whitmore sat at the head of the table. Beside him, the independent civil rights compliance officer appointed by the district court, a woman named Dr. Bernadette Foles, 58, who held joint appointments in law and public administration at Rice University, and who had been brought in specifically because she had no prior relationship with the Houston Federal Courthouse or any of its personnel. Completing the panel was a representative from the Courthouse Security Contractors National Office, a man named Richard Galt who had flown in from Virginia, and who had in his 14 years with the company sat in on 2 prior hearings of this nature, and was notable in this one for the complete absence of defensiveness in his bearing. Dale Pruitt sat on one side of the table with his attorney Cynthia Albright, who was a union-assigned lawyer of genuine competence with careful eyes and the practiced composure of someone who had represented people in difficult situations before and had learned that competence in those situations required a clear-eyed assessment of facts that your client would prefer to be different. The first person to testify was Connor Briggs. He sat without his union attorney. He had one, but had elected to testify without her. A decision she had counseled against and that he had made anyway because he felt, though he could not have articulated this precisely, that having representation present would make him look like he was trying to protect himself from the truth, rather than trying to give it. His account was methodical and damaging in the way that accurate accounts are damaging when the facts do not favor the person they describe. He confirmed that Loretta had stated her title. He confirmed that no identification had been requested before Pruitt initiated physical contact. He confirmed that he had moved to his position based entirely on reading Pruitt's posture, and not on any independent assessment of the situation. He confirmed that he had not at any point heard Pruitt ask whether she had credentials in her bag or suggest waiting for her to produce them. Dr. Foles asked him one question that the room held quietly for a moment after: if Officer Pruitt had stopped and asked her to produce her judicial ID before making any physical contact, what do you believe would have happened? Connor thought about this for what felt like a long time. She would have shown it to us, he said, and we would have let her through. Gary Rush testified after Briggs. He brought his own documentation, the compiled file, the 3 prior complaints, his own written account of the decisions he had made about each one. He did not attempt to minimize or reframe any of it. He read the 2016 complaint aloud when asked. He read the 2019 complaint. He read the 2021 complaint. He described each informal resolution and the reasoning he had applied at the time, and he described what he now understood about the difference between resolving an incident and addressing a pattern. It cost him something visible to do this. The room could see it. The physical evidence was presented through the compliance officer, Patricia Odom's video. The incident report in Pruitt's handwriting. The scanner maintenance log showing the malfunction had been reported by overnight facilities staff at 11:30 p.m. the prior evening, and had not been communicated to the daytime security team. The new personnel briefing attendance records showing Pruitt's name and the notation shift trade/absent. Cynthia Albright made her notes throughout all of this. She was not panicking. She was too good at her job to panic. But she was building in the margins of her legal pad a map of a case that had at its center a gap between what was written in Pruitt's personnel file and what was written in the supplementary incident log, and that gap was wide enough to drive a federal civil rights complaint through without effort. Pruitt sat beside her with his hands folded on the table. He had not looked at the video when it was played. He had looked at the table. When Albright leaned over and said something quietly to him, he nodded. Not in agreement exactly. In the way of a man who has been told something he already understood and needed someone to say out loud. The blazer, not the charcoal one from the morning, but a deep navy. A color she had worn for 20 years in courtrooms before she was the one behind the bench, and dark slacks and the reading glasses on the beaded chain and her father's briefcase, which she set on the floor beside her chair, the way she always set it on the floor when she sat down somewhere official. Dr. Foles had asked her in the preliminary exchange about preferences whether she intended to testify in her judicial capacity or as an individual. Loretta's answer had taken only a sentence. The incident had happened to her as a woman, not as a judge, and she would speak about it as a woman. This sentence sat in the room for a moment before the testimony began, and everyone present understood, or should have, what it carried: the deliberate choice of a person who was not going to allow the magnitude of her institutional position to absorb or obscure the simple human fact of what had happened to her body on those steps that morning. She gave her account in order. She described her arrival, the scanner malfunction, the approach to the checkpoint. She described stating her name and title. She described the hand on her briefcase. She described complying with the instruction to step back and why she complied, and what the calculation was and what it felt like to be a black woman in an American institution doing that calculation at 6:34 in the morning on the way to the courtroom where she was the presiding authority. She did not cry. Not because she felt nothing the room could feel, that she felt a great deal, but because her father had taught her that tears in a room where someone is trying to decide if you deserved what happened to you gave that room the option of making the tears the story instead of the facts. And the facts were the story. Dr. Foles asked her at one point why she had not more forcefully insisted on being heard, why she had not demanded to speak to a supervisor, why she had not refused to move until someone with higher authority was summoned. Loretta looked at the compliance officer with the full-level attention of someone who has been waiting for this question and has an answer she has been carrying for a long time. "I wasn't trying to get into your building, officer," she said quietly and without drama. "I was trying to get to my courtroom." The room absorbed this. She continued. In 29 years, she said she had learned that a black woman asserting herself clearly and loudly in a space where someone has already decided she doesn't belong does not typically result in being believed. It results in being described as aggressive. It results in the paperwork containing words like escalated and combative and non-compliant, and it results in a conversation that is no longer about whether she belongs there, but about how she behaved when she was told she didn't. She had made a calculation. It was not a calculation she should have had to make. It was a calculation she had made 24 times in her professional life in buildings that were supposed to be on her side. And she was tired of it, and she was going to say so clearly for the record because that was what the record was for. Cynthia Albright had 3 questions on cross-examination. She used all 3, carefully trying to establish the procedural context, the malfunctioning scanner, the absence of visible credentials, the unfamiliar face of a recently appointed judge whose portrait had not yet been hung in the hallway. Each question had a legitimate procedural logic to it. The logic of a lawyer trying to establish that the situation, whatever its outcome, had a defensible reading. Loretta answered each question with the unhurried patience of a federal judge who has heard weaker arguments and ruled on them with complete equanimity. She agreed that her ID was not visible on her person. She agreed that Pruitt did not know her face. She agreed that the scanner malfunction was not Pruitt's fault. She agreed with every fact that was a fact. And then she noted precisely and without hostility that the protocol for verifying the identity of an individual without visible credentials was to ask for the credentials before initiating physical contact, not after, and that this protocol was written clearly in the training manual, and that the malfunction, the unfamiliar face, and the absent portrait were all conditions that made the verification protocol more important, not less. Albright had no further questions. Loretta picked up her reading glasses from the table. She stood up. She smoothed the front of the navy blazer, the same gesture, the same hand, the same small act of self-possession, and she walked back to her seat. The compliance officer, Dr. Foles, was writing in her notebook, and she did not look up, and the pen did not stop moving. Richard Gall from the Security Contractors National Office had been taking notes of his own throughout the testimony, and at this point he set down his pen and looked at the ceiling briefly. The look of a man adding up numbers and not being surprised by the sum, but being sobered by it anyway. Whitmore said, "We'll take a 15-minute recess." The room stood. Loretta went to the hallway. She stood near the window at the end of the corridor looking down at the front plaza at the steps. The 4th step from the bottom was a step like any other. The morning fog was gone, had been gone for weeks. The October light was sharp and particular, the light of a city you knew well on a day you would not forget. She looked at it for a moment, then she went back inside. She wore her good coat, not her best. Her best was for church and funerals, the navy wool with the silver buttons, but her good one, the charcoal gray with the brass buttons, her daughter had been threatening to replace for 3 years. She had her church hat too, the small black one with the grosgrain ribbon, because she had decided getting dressed that morning that if she was going to say something important in an official room, she was going to look like she meant it. She was 61 years old and had no legal training and had never testified before any kind of official body in her life, and she was not nervous about this in the way she had expected to be, because as she sat down across from the panel and looked at the faces of the people who were going to listen to her, she realized that she had been preparing for this particular testimony for 35 years without knowing it every morning in a classroom. Every conversation with a child about what was fair and what was right and what you did when those two things came apart. She told them what she had seen. She used plain language. She did not use legal terms because she did not know them, and she did not try to use them because she understood instinctively that the value of what she had to say was precisely that it was plain that it was the account of an ordinary citizen standing at a bus stop who had watched something happen and had recognized it immediately and clearly as wrong. She said a woman who was not running, not shouting, not threatening anyone trying to explain herself was moved physically by 2 men who did not appear to have listened to her explanation. She said the woman's briefcase scraped the ground. She said no one around her did anything, including herself, and she was going to say that clearly because it was true, because she had stood there and filmed it instead of crossing the street, and she wanted the record to know that she had made that choice, and she was not entirely comfortable with it. Dr. Foles asked her why she hadn't intervened physically. Patricia answered without hesitation because she had thought about this question many times in the 6 weeks since that morning. "Because I'm 61 years old, and I know how that ends for a black woman in front of a courthouse." The room was quiet for a moment. She explained about her son, Darnell. Not at length, not as evidence of anything except her own perspective. She told the room about the parking garage and the 2 mornings, and the way her son had learned the calculation without being taught it explicitly because the world teaches it whether you want it to or not. She said she had filmed it because of Darnell. Because she had a son who was an accountant with his name on a parking spot and his name on a business card, and who had still been stopped twice walking to his own building, and she had started filming things after the first time because she did not know if filming helped, but she knew that not filming hadn't helped, and she had come to believe that the record mattered more than the reaction. She said she had not posted the video because her daughter had asked her to wait, and her daughter was smarter than she was about these things, and waiting had turned out to be the right choice. Dr. Foles wrote something long in her notebook. When Patricia finished, she folded her hands in her lap. She had said everything she came to say. The room was the room, and the official people in it were going to do what they were going to do. And she was 61 years old, and retired, and had learned enough in that time to know that she could not control what institutions did with the truth once she gave it to them. She could only give it. She looked across the table at Loretta, who was sitting 3 seats down with the navy blazer and the reading glasses on the chain, and Loretta looked back at her, and something passed between them that did not need to be spoken, and would not have been improved by being spoken the look of 2 women in a room where their presence required explanation, refusing to apologize for being there. Patricia gave a small nod. Loretta gave one back. The panel called a recess. Patricia collected her purse and her library bag. She had books to return afterward. She had been carrying them around for a week and a half, and walked into the hallway and stood near the window and looked out at the city and thought, good. Just that. Just good. 16 days later, on a Thursday morning in November, the same people gathered in the same conference room 3C, and Chief Judge Whitmore read the findings aloud into the record in the methodical, deliberate voice of a man who understood that the words he was reading would be consulted long after this room had emptied. The findings established first the facts on October 14th. Officer Dale Pruitt of the courthouse security detail had made physical contact with and escorted from the premises the Honorable Loretta Mae Caldwell, a sitting federal judge assigned to the Southern District of Texas, without requesting or receiving identification, without following the verification protocol written in the courthouse security manual, and despite a clear verbal statement from Judge Caldwell identifying herself by name and title. Officer Connor Briggs had participated in the physical escort without taking any independent steps to verify her identity or question the decision. The findings established second the pattern Officer Pruitt had been the subject of 3 prior complaints over 7 years, each involving the treatment of black individuals attempting to access courthouse facilities, each resolved without formal documentation in his personnel file. Each resolution approved in the case of the most recent by the current security director, Gary Rush. Then Whitmore read the consequences, and he read them carefully and completely, because consequences read aloud in their full specificity are the only form of accountability that actually sounds like what it is. Dale Pruitt terminated effective the date of the incident, October 14th. 40% of his accrued pension benefits, representing the portion accumulated since the first documented complaint in 2016, forfeited pursuant to the federal contractor's employment agreement provisions for civil rights violations. Permanent decertification from courthouse security employment under any federal contract. A civil rights violation notation in his federal employment record which was permanent and would accompany every future background check for every future employer. As a condition of the matter being resolved administratively rather than referred for federal criminal prosecution under 18 U.S.C. Section 242. The deprivation of civil rights under color of law. Pruitt was required to complete 120 hours of civil rights education through a program approved by the Federal District's Compliance Office. Cynthia Albright, seated beside Pruitt, did not move when the pension figure was read. She had told him privately the week before that this was the outcome she had negotiated down to, and that the alternative was a federal criminal referral that carried the possibility of actual incarceration. She had told him this as clearly and directly as she was capable of telling anything, and he had sat across from her in her office and understood what she was saying, and had been very quiet for a long time afterward. Connor Briggs. Formal written censure entered into his permanent personnel file. A 90-day suspension without pay. Mandatory civil rights training and requalification as a condition of reinstatement. His youth, he was 31, and the documented fact that he had been operating within a workplace culture shaped by Pruitt's unchallenged example were identified as mitigating factors in the decision not to recommend termination. The panel was direct about what mitigation meant in this context. It was not absolution. It was a recognition that Connor Briggs had been formed professionally in an environment that had not taught him the right things, and that the appropriate response to that was correction, not only punishment. Gary Rush, formal written reprimand, entered into his personnel file. A supervised performance improvement period of 1 year, during which his decisions regarding complaint resolution would be reviewed by a third-party compliance auditor. The panel noted, and Whitmore read this with particular care, that Rush's full cooperation and his voluntary unprompted self-authored account of his own prior decisions had been considered, and that they represented precisely the kind of institutional self-examination that the hearing was designed to encourage. The courthouse security contractor required to implement at all 5 Houston-area federal courthouses under its contract a new mandatory briefing protocol for all incoming judicial personnel that included photograph badge number and access authorization to be completed within 30 days of appointment and recommunicated to all security staff. Required to implement biometric ID verification at all primary checkpoints. Required to mandate annual civil rights certification for all security staff as a condition of continued contract. When Whitmore finished reading, the room was quiet. Pruitt was looking at the table. He had been looking at the table for most of the reading. At some point during the pension section, his jaw had tightened, not dramatically, not in any way that was legible as complaint, but in the way of a man absorbing a physical force and holding himself together in response to it. He was 52 years old. The math was not forgiving. 40% of 26 years. He had done the calculation many times in the past 2 weeks, in the small room off the I-10 where he was staying at the kitchen table where Sandra was no longer sitting across from him. He had done it enough times to stop doing it, because doing it again did not change the number. Albright leaned over and said something to him quietly. He nodded. He picked up the copy of the findings that had been placed in front of him. He put it in his briefcase. He stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He did not look at Loretta, who was sitting 3 seats down, and she did not look at him, and whatever was in that mutual not looking was something the room could feel, but no one was going to name. Whitmore gavelled the hearing closed. People gathered their things and moved toward the door with the particular quiet efficiency of people exiting a room where something final has happened. The separation papers were filed on a Tuesday morning, 3 months after the hearing, 4 months after the morning on the steps, and Sandra Pruitt had chosen Tuesday deliberately not as a symbol of anything, but because Tuesday was the day she had a half day at the dental practice, and she would be home by noon, which meant she would have the afternoon to sit in the house she had lived in for 19 years, and let it be what it now was, which was something different from what it had been. She had told Dale 2 weeks earlier. Not in the kitchen, not at the table where they had sat that afternoon in October. She had sat with him on the back porch in the old wicker chairs with Rex sleeping between them on the boards. The way he had slept between them for 11 years, because she had needed to be somewhere that felt like the life they had actually had, not just the idea of it. She had told him she did not know who she had been married to. Not that she didn't love him. Love was not the question she was working with. The question she was working with was simpler and harder than love she had thought. She knew what kind of man he was, and she had been wrong in a way that mattered, and she needed time to understand what it meant to have been wrong about that, and she could not do that with him in the same house. Dale had not argued. He had sat in the wicker chair with his hands on his knees and Rex's old head warm against his ankle and listened with the particular stillness of a man who has used up his arguments, who has run the version of events where he is not responsible to its end and found the end doesn't hold, and who is sitting now in the only remaining version, which is the one where the things he did are simply the things he did. He had a room in a complex off the I-10. He worked nights at a hardware distribution warehouse inventory and stocking physical work with his hands. Work that required nothing of him except showing up and moving correctly in the dark. Sandra drove past the Houston Federal Courthouse on her way to work every morning. She had tried for a while not to look at it. Then she had stopped trying. She looked at it now the way you look at a building. It was there. It was stone and glass. It was what it was and what had happened inside it, and on its steps was not the building's fault, and she had no quarrel with the building. She had a quarrel with herself, to be precise. With the years she had spent not looking closely enough at the stories her husband told with the explanations she had accepted because accepting them was easier, and because she had loved him, and because love sometimes is a very efficient reason not to look. She was looking now. Rex was with her. Dale had left him when he moved because the dog was old and the warehouse complex didn't allow animals, and because Rex had been Pruitt's dog in name, but had always been the house's dog in fact, and the house was Sandra's now. He was lying in a patch of afternoon sun on the kitchen floor when she came home from the attorney's office. She sat beside him on the linoleum and put her hand on his old side and felt him breathe slow and even and deeply untroubled, the breathing of an animal that had never made the particular kind of mistake that required reckoning with. She sat there for a while. Then she got up and made coffee and stood at the window looking at the backyard which needed raking and made a list of things that needed doing and began. He drafted it 3 times before he was satisfied, and satisfaction was not quite the right word. He was not satisfied, he was simply done in the way you are done with something when you have wrung it as close to the truth as you are capable of getting, and further revision is just avoidance wearing the clothes of improvement. It was a Thursday in December, 6 weeks into his suspension. He had been spending the suspension in a way he hadn't entirely expected, reading mostly, which was not something he had done much of since high school. His attorney had given him a short list of books after the hearing, the specific kind of books that people give you when they are trying to tell you something important without saying it directly. Histories, memoirs, accounts of people navigating institutions and the gaps between what institutions say they are and what they do. He had read them, the way you read things that make you uncomfortable slowly with frequent stops with the feeling of something being rearranged inside you that had been in the wrong position for a long time. His attorney had told him when he asked about the letter that sending it was legally neutral. Neither helpful nor harmful to his case, which was already resolved. He was not sending it because of the case. He knew that. He thought Loretta Caldwell deserved to know that too, which was part of why he was writing it. He told her in the letter that he was not asking for forgiveness. He was clear about this because asking for forgiveness would have made the letter about his need for absolution rather than about his attempt to account for himself. And those were 2 different things, and he had spent enough of his suspension thinking about the difference between them to know he did not want to confuse them. He told her that he had spent 6 weeks trying to understand how he had walked into work on the morning of October 14th as someone who believed himself to be fair and had walked out as a person who had put his hands on a federal judge without asking her name. He told her he did not have a clean answer. He had a set of partial answers that taken together made a picture he did not like. He had deferred without thought to a man he had decided was an authority on the building and the people in it. He had read posture instead of thinking. He had moved when he should have asked. He told her he had been taught in 2 years of working beside Dale Pruitt a version of the job that he was only now understanding was not the version written in the manual. He was not saying this to shift responsibility. He was a grown man who had made choices and the choices were his. He was saying it because the training manual had been clear, and he had chosen someone else's example over it, and that was a choice he had made, and he wanted to say so. He sealed the letter. He held it for a moment. He sent it. Loretta read it on a Friday afternoon between the morning and afternoon dockets in the anteroom behind courtroom 4B. She read it twice. She sat with it for a moment the way she sat with things that required sitting with. She did not write back. She did not know if she would. That was not a decision she had made, it was simply not a decision she had made yet, and she was a person who had learned not to make decisions before they were ready to be made. She folded the letter. She put it in the bottom drawer of her desk. Not the trash that would have been a verdict she wasn't ready to deliver, Not her reading pile that would have been something else. The bottom drawer, which was where she put things she intended to return to in time when she had something to say. Dana knocked on the anteroom door. The 2 o'clock docket was ready. Loretta picked up her robe. She put it on. She went back to the bench. Wheatley, Yeepy Elementary was not Patricia's school anymore. She had retired 3 years ago after 35 years. But it was still her school in the way that places become yours after you have given them your most careful attention for long enough. She knew which hallway still smelled like the old gymnasium, even though they had renovated it. She knew the water fountain outside the library that always ran slightly colder than the others. She knew, from the particular quality of sound in the building at 8:15 a.m., whether the day was going to be a calm one or a complicated one. She came on Tuesdays and Thursdays to read to the 5th graders. Not educational reading, not curriculum, not vocabulary, exercises, just reading out loud. Whatever she had found interesting lately, whatever seemed worth hearing. She had been doing this since September, and the children had decided after about 3 sessions that she was someone worth listening to, which was not a thing 5th graders decided easily or without cause. She was there on a Thursday in December when Linda Park, the school librarian, a woman of meticulous enthusiasm who maintained a bulletin board of local news items relevant to social studies, came to the library door holding a folded newspaper and a look that said she had been waiting to share this since approximately 7:30 a.m. The article was in the Houston Chronicle, page 3, under the headline, Federal Courthouse Overhauls Security Protocols. Following Rights Review. It was 12 paragraphs long. The 6th paragraph quoted Chief Judge Harold Whitmore. The events of October 14th were a serious institutional failure that required a serious institutional response. The protocols being implemented today are a direct result of that failure, and they will apply to every federal courthouse in this district. The 7th paragraph mentioned by name the incident involving Judge Loretta May Caldwell, recently appointed, and the administrative hearing that followed. Patricia read the article twice, standing in the library doorway. She went into the classroom. 8 5th-graders were already settled cross-legged on the reading rug. 2 more were finishing their breakfast. One was drawing something on the back of her hand with a pencil which Patricia noted and decided to address after. She sat in the reading chair. She held the newspaper in her lap. "I want to tell you about something that happened here in Houston," she said. Not a reading aloud voice, just her voice, the same voice she had used in this school for 35 years, the one that said, "This matters, pay attention." She told them about the courthouse. She told them about the morning fog and the woman with the briefcase. She told them in language she had thought about carefully what had happened on the steps, what the security officer had done, and what the woman had done, and why those 2 things were so different from what they should have been. She told them about the investigation and the hearing. She translated the legal outcome into terms they could understand. The officer had lost his job and part of his retirement pay, which were the things a person earned over a lifetime of working and had lost them because what he did was wrong, and the people responsible for making it right had made it right. She told them that because one woman had gone to work that morning and refused to disappear quietly, the rules had changed for every courthouse in Texas. Not just one building, all of them. Every person walking into every federal courthouse in this state would encounter from that point forward a different set of protocols because one woman had stood her ground, and because other people had paid attention, and because the record had been kept, and because the record had been used. A girl in the front row. 10 years old, braids, the kind of serious expression that suggested she was going to ask something complicated, raised her hand. Was she scared? The girl asked. Patricia thought about Loretta on the steps, the briefcase in her lap, the reading glasses slightly askew, the face composed in that particular costly way. "Yes," Patricia said, "and she went anyway. That's the whole story." The girl wrote something in her notebook. Patricia did not see what she wrote. She would wonder about it later on the bus home at dinner, in the small quiet moments of ordinary life, what a 10-year-old had found worth writing down in that sentence. She hoped it was the right part. She thought it probably was. She read them a chapter of the book she had brought, something else, something lighter, a story about a boy and a river and a summer that changed everything because you did not want to be the person who only showed up with hard things, and the morning moved forward the way mornings did in good schools with the sound of pencils and questions, and someone in the hallway doing something inadvisable near the water fountain. Patricia Odom drove home at 11:15 and made herself lunch and sat at her kitchen table and thought about how when she had pressed record on her phone at the bus stop, she had not known what she was recording except that it was wrong. She had not known the name of the woman on the steps. She had not known that the video would end up in a federal hearing. She had not known that anything she did would matter. She had pressed record anyway. That she thought putting her lunch plate in the sink was also the whole story. They hung it on a Monday in January, which was a quiet day, and the courthouse docket's light hallways unhurried the building in that particular state of post-holiday recalibration, where everything was technically open and most things were still waking up. The ceremony was small at Loretta's explicit request. She had told Dana when the framing company had finally delivered the mat board and the portrait was ready, no speeches, no reception, no official photographs of the official photograph being unveiled. Whoever wanted to be there could be there. It would take 10 minutes and then she had a 100 docket. The portrait showed her in her robe. The black fabric with the particular drape of something made to fit the reading glasses on the beaded chain. A slight curve at the corner of her mouth that a photographer who did not know her might have called a smile, but that Monica Hayes, standing in the third row, recognized as something more specific, the expression of a person who is exactly where they decided to be doing exactly what they intended to do, and is aware of both those facts simultaneously. In the background of the portrait, nearly out of frame, placed there by a photographer who had noticed it on her desk and thought it worth including, was the worn leather briefcase. It was barely visible. The corner of it, the worn corner against the desk's edge. If you knew to look for it, you saw it. If you didn't know, it was just the edge of something. Monica Hayes was there. She stood near the wall, slightly back from the small crowd, and watched the portrait go up with the expression of a woman who had stood at a window and watched something terrible happen, and then spent the following months being part of what came after. Ray Dunbar was there in his marshal's jacket on the left side of the hallway. He had not said much about October 14th in the months since, not because he had nothing to say, but because everything that needed saying had been said in the formal record, and he was a man who believed in the formal record and what it was for. Gary Rush was not there. He was in his office, which was where he had been spending a great deal of time lately working through the first quarter of his supervised improvement period with the conscientious attention of a man who has understood recently and at some cost what the work was actually for. Chief Judge Whitmore stood near the front. He had said when Loretta told him no speeches, understood, and he had meant it. Patricia Odom was there in her good coat. Loretta had called her personally 3 weeks before and asked if she would come. Patricia had said yes before the question was fully out. She stood near the portrait after it went up looking at it with the attention she had given to many things in her 61 years that mattered more than they appeared to. The woman in the portrait and the woman who had been on the steps were the same woman. That was the thing worth looking at. The robe was different from the blazer, the bench was different from the step, but the face was the same face, and the set of the shoulders was the same, and the briefcase in the corner was the same. Briefcase. Loretta thanked everyone briefly, and specifically the kind of thanks that named what each person had done and meant it without inflating it into something it wasn't. She thanked Monica. She thanked Ray. She looked at Patricia and said, "I know what you did, and I know what it cost you to stand there and do it. Thank you." Patricia said, "I was going to miss my bus anyway." 1 or 2 people laughed. Loretta smiled, the real one this time, the one that went further than the portrait's curve. Then she said she had a 100 docket. She thanked everyone again. She walked down the corridor. The hallway settled back into its Monday quiet. The portrait was on the wall. It was a wall in a courthouse, which was a building where people came to have important things settled and where the record mattered and where the truth given time and the right attention generally found its way into the right room. It was a Friday in February late and courtroom 4B was empty. The bailiff had gone home at 5:30. The afternoon light had moved through its long February arc, pale and thin. The light of a city in the last month before spring. The light that doesn't quite commit, and now the room was in that particular evening state of a space that runs on human presence and had released it for the day. Chairs at rest, the bench, standing in its own authority with no one behind it. The gallery, still. Loretta was at the bench gathering her files. She did this slowly at the end of Fridays, not because it was complicated, but because Friday evenings in the empty courtroom were one of the few times in her week when no one required anything of her, and she had learned over 29 years to use those moments. She stacked the folders in order. She capped her pen. She put the reading glasses in their case. She reached down beside the bench and picked up the briefcase. It was the same briefcase it had always been, worn at the corners. Handles smooth where her palm had shaped it over decades. The brass clasp that clicked the way it had always clicked, not loudly but firmly, with the particular satisfaction of something that still worked exactly as intended. Her father was having more difficult days than good ones now. Last week, she had sat with him for 2 hours on a Sunday afternoon, and he had looked at her with all the gentleness that was still completely intact. His capacity for gentleness had not diminished at all. It was one of the things the illness left alone, as if knowing it was load-bearing, but her name had been somewhere he couldn't quite reach. She had told him about the week's cases, keeping the details simple, and he had listened with the focused attention of a man who understood that something important was being told to him even when the specifics were beyond reach. She had not yet told him about October 14th. She was still finding the words that would do justice to both the harm and the outcome, because she had learned from him that some stories required the right container, and you did not pour them into an approximation. She was closer, though. She thought she knew the shape of it now that the hearing was done and the portrait was up and the protocols had changed. The shape of it was a woman went to work, and something terrible happened, and the terrible thing became a matter of record, and the record was used to build something better, and the something better would outlast every person in the room where it was built. She thought that was a story worth telling. She thought her father would find the right part of it. She held the briefcase for a moment in the half-dark of the empty courtroom. She thought about him on his porch steps 30 years ago, setting it in her hands. The worn corners, the brass clasp, the smell of old leather and old paper. Carry it like it's yours, because it is. She picked up her files. She turned off the bench light. She walked out of this courtroom into the corridor, past the gallery doors, past the clerk's window, past the portrait at the end of the hallway. She didn't stop to look at it. She knew it was there. That was enough. She went to the main entrance. The overnight security officer was a young man on his first week posted at the checkpoint, where the old checkpoint had been equipped now with a biometric reader and a printed roster of all current judicial and staff personnel standard under the new protocol. He was 24. Earnest, learning the rhythms of a building, he would come to know the way all people come to know buildings, where they spend their days slowly, specifically, until the place feels like an extension of themselves. He held the door for her. "Evening, Judge," he said. "Evening," she said. She walked out into the Houston night. The steps were the same steps, 31 of them. Wide granite treads, the institutional architecture of a building that had been built to last, and had. She went down them without counting. She went to the bus stop on the corner and waited for the 7B. The city moved around her the way it always moved, ordinary and relentless and full of people going home from work, carrying the day with them, heading toward whatever came next. The bus arrived. She got on. She carried the briefcase in her lap all the way to Sunnyside. This story is a fictional dramatization created for entertainment and educational purposes. All characters, events, and institutions depicted are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real persons living or dead, or to actual events, is purely coincidental. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something true, please hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story, and leave a comment below. What would you have done, standing at that bus stop, watching what Patricia watched? We'd love to hear from you.